This video discusses historical events related to World War II. It is presented in an educational, non-graphic, documentary format. Between 1935 and 1937, the United States Congress passed a series of laws known as the Neutrality Acts. These laws were intended to prevent the United States from being drawn into foreign wars. Many lawmakers believed that American involvement in World War I had not been accidental. They argued that economic ties, arms sales, and wartime loans had gradually pushed the country toward conflict. The Neutrality Acts were designed to interrupt that process. By restricting trade and finance, Congress aimed to remove the mechanisms that had previously linked American interests to foreign wars. The laws imposed strict limitations. They prohibited the sale of weapons to nations at war. They banned loans and credits to belligerent countries. They restricted the use of American ships for transporting war materials. These provisions were written broadly. They applied equally to all belligerents. The laws did not distinguish between aggressors and victims. Under U.S. law, all nations at war were treated the same. This approach reflected a specific understanding of neutrality. Lawmakers believed that equal treatment would keep the United States detached from foreign conflicts. Neutrality was defined as uniform distance rather than moral judgment. Congress retained primary authority over neutrality policy. Enforcement did not rest with the president alone. This reflected a broader concern about executive power in foreign affairs. Lawmakers wanted to ensure that no single administration could move the country toward war without legislative approval. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. A general war had begun in Europe. The United States formally declared neutrality. Under the existing Neutrality Acts, Britain and France were subject to the same legal restrictions as Germany. All three nations faced identical limitations on purchasing American goods. This situation exposed a structural problem. Britain depended heavily on overseas imports for its war effort. It required weapons, raw materials, and industrial supplies. Germany, with access to continental resources and recent territorial gains, was less dependent on transatlantic trade. The neutrality framework did not account for this difference. The law treated unequal situations as if they were equal. Strategic realities were not reflected in legal categories. President Franklin D. Roosevelt expressed concern about this outcome. He argued publicly that developments in Europe affected American security. He warned that a hostile power dominating Europe could alter the global balance. However, Roosevelt remained constrained by law. He could not revise neutrality policy on his own. Any change required congressional action. In 1939, Congress was not prepared to abandon neutrality. The outbreak of war revealed a central limitation of the Neutrality Acts. They were designed to prevent entanglement through uniform restrictions. They were not designed to manage a situation in which neutrality itself created strategic risk. In November 1939, Congress revised U.S. neutrality policy. The Neutrality Act of 1939 repealed the arms embargo and introduced the cash and carry system. This revision reflected growing concern about the European war. Lawmakers sought a limited adjustment rather than a full abandonment of neutrality. Cash and carry was presented as a compromise. Under cash and carry, nations at war could purchase arms and other goods from the United States. They were required to pay in cash. They also had to transport the goods using their own ships. These requirements served specific purposes. Cash payment eliminated the problem of unpaid wartime debts. During World War I, such debts had caused long-term financial disputes. Lawmakers wanted to avoid a repeat. Requiring foreign ships to transport goods reduced risk to the United States. American vessels would not enter war zones. American sailors would not be exposed to attack. In legal terms, cash and carry preserved neutrality. The policy did not name specific allies. Any belligerent could participate under the same rules. In practice, the effects were uneven. Britain benefited most from the system. The British Navy controlled major sea lanes. British merchant ships could reach American ports and return safely. Germany faced a different situation. British naval power limited German access to overseas trade. Although Germany was not excluded by law, it could not use the system effectively. By 1940, the limitations of cash and carry became increasingly clear. Britain's financial reserves were declining. Sustained war placed pressure on its ability to pay for supplies. At the same time, Germany achieved major military successes in Europe. These developments raised concerns in Washington. Policymakers considered the consequences of a British defeat. In September 1940, the United States and Britain reached the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The United States transferred 50 older destroyers to Britain. In exchange, it received long-term leases for military bases in the Western Hemisphere. The agreement was structured to avoid Senate approval as a treaty. The Roosevelt administration presented it as an executive action related to defense. Officials argued that the bases strengthened American security. They described the destroyers as surplus to U.S. needs. This framing allowed the agreement to proceed within existing authority. The arrangement represented a further shift. Although neutrality remained the official policy, the United States had now transferred military equipment directly to a nation at war. This step did not end neutrality in law, but it narrowed the distance between neutrality and active support. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. This legislation marked the most significant change in U.S. neutrality policy. Lend-Lease authorized the president to supply military materials to countries whose defense was considered vital to U.S. security. The law removed the requirement for immediate payment. This change addressed the central weakness of cash and carry. Britain no longer needed to exhaust its financial reserves to obtain American supplies. Before December 1941, Britain was the primary recipient of Lend-Lease assistance. The United States provided ships, aircraft, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, food, and raw materials. The scale of support expanded rapidly. American industry became closely tied to Britain's war effort. This connection developed without a formal declaration of war. The debate over Lend-Lease was extensive. Supporters argued that aiding Britain reduced long-term risks to American security. They viewed material support as a substitute for direct involvement. Opponents argued that providing weapons to a belligerent nation undermined neutrality. They warned that Lend-Lease blurred the line between non-participation and war. Congress approved the legislation by substantial margins. These votes indicated a shift in how lawmakers defined national interest. Neutrality was no longer seen as an absolute condition. After Lend-Lease, neutrality continued to exist as a legal status. The United States was not formally at war. American forces were not fighting in Europe. At the same time, neutrality no longer functioned in practice. The United States was supplying one side of the conflict on a large scale. Economic and industrial involvement had replaced legal distance. Historians generally agree that between 1939 and 1941, the Neutrality Acts gradually lost their effectiveness. The laws could not accommodate changing strategic conditions. Historians debate whether this process was deliberate or reactive. Some emphasize planning, others emphasize circumstance. What is widely accepted is the outcome. By late 1941, U.S. neutrality existed primarily in legal terms. Formal entry into the war occurred only after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. If you like exploring history beyond the textbook, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more ahead.